Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the third session of Calc, or second session, I forget what we've called it. My name is Michelle Bond. I'm one of the conference co-organisers, and I'm also your host slash moderator for this session. Sorry. So this session is being recorded, and we will have time for a Q&A with Sarah at the end of this session. So as with all sessions, if you have any questions for our presenter, please directly message me. I am the top of the user list, and I will collate those questions and ask them of Sarah when we get to her Q&A section. So really pleased to welcome Sarah Hammond to the conference and her talk now on one subdivision at a time. I will just hand over to Sarah. Okay, Sarah, off you go.
Hi, just to check again, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I'll just... Hi, so I'm Sarah. I'm a library assistant at the Squire Law Library, which is one of the affiliate libraries at the University of Cambridge. I do most of our cataloguing and classification, which is what I'm going to talk about today, which I hope is okay. So we have an in-house classification scheme, which I meant to have a hard copy of, and I can't find it. But I'm just going to try and discuss some issues that I've identified since I've started working with it, and kind of link this into wider discussions about classification and library use of classification schemes. Just a caveat, I've been working from home for about 2 months now, so I haven't had access to everything that I was planning on to prepare this, and I also haven't been doing any classification in that time, so I'm trying my best. And I've had to use some photographs from my phone rather than scans, but I think it looks okay. I'm going to turn my camera off now, but feel free to use the chat and the notes and send Michelle any questions, and hopefully I will get to those at the end. So this is a picture of the Squire Law Library, which I'm just going to leave up while I get started with what I mean when I say classification scheme, because I think for a lot of people, classification can kind of begin and end at the numbers on a spine of a book. And from my time in libraries, I've picked up the impression that people generally either see this as a necessary evil or just like organizational, but I'm hoping in this talk I'll be able to unpack that a tiny bit. So I'd imagine most people are familiar with the big classification schemes that are used in a lot of different libraries around the world. So I guess I'm talking about Dewey and Library of Congress mainly. But as I mentioned today, I'm going to talk about smaller ones, namely the one that we use at the Squire Law Library. This is because it's what I'm most familiar with, obviously. And also, I think there are some really unique problems with custom and small-scale classification schemes that I'm hoping some people can relate to. I also know that there are already lots of debates happening sort of in the broader library world about areas of other classification schemes, the big ones, whereas obviously there's no need for that kind of global debate if it's only used in one or two libraries. I think it's also, I'm going to note here that I know that all of them have their own issues, but a huge plus point of the big classification schemes is that as they are so large and universal, there are usually some sort of established structures for change. So there are delineated ways of submitting suggestions for updates and alterations. And obviously that doesn't mean that they're always listened to or acted upon, but there is something of a centralized body dealing with the language, structure, and breadth of a scheme, which, again, you don't have with smaller ones. I also think it's useful. Those ones are usually publicly accessible. There's somewhere online that you can go in and look at them and see what all the different things are, whereas I know as we have in 4 hard copies, there's no sort of centralized version or a publicly accessible one. So just going to give a quick background on the library. So Squire Law Library is the law library at the University of Cambridge. We have one of the largest academic legal collections in the UK, and we're also included in Cambridge University Library's legal deposit status, which I'm going to come back to later. So our classification scheme was written in the early 1970s by the librarian at the time called Willie Steiner, and it's been almost entirely unchanged since the 1970s. This is predominantly because I think the person who held my post before me was there for about 40 years, and I don't think saw any need to change it, which is fine. But also, Willie Steiner plays a really big role in the library's history, and I think particularly somewhere like Cambridge, which values institutional history so much, you have to tread very carefully if you do want to make some changes, and that can be tricky. The scheme was written to order the collections at the time in the building space that they were in, so it was very specifically written for one moment in time, and this is important for two reasons. One, because the library has moved and the collections don't fit into space the same way, so it's completely disrupted the order. And also it's an alphabetical scheme, apart from the running numbers at the end, and the alphabet is very limited in its scope. And I have, one tiny positive piece of feedback for Dewey, and that is that at least he realised that numbers are infinite and you can kind of go further with them if you need to. So just for sort of reference, I've included here the publication details and the title page of our scheme. I think you can definitely tell it's written by a librarian. I don't think it was ever properly published, but he's included all of that anyway. And apologies for my drawing skills. On to the next slide, which I've just written out what our class muck looks like, because I think it's probably useful for some of the things I'm going to go on to. So it goes jurisdiction, subject, form, author, surname, and then the running number. I'm going to talk a little bit about the jurisdiction and subject division sections, and then finish up with a bit about the changing use and needs of the library itself and how that interacts with classification. And I'm hoping that it won't be too boring and that it is not just me being self-indulgent. So I start with jurisdiction. So to completely oversimplify it, I think jurisdiction is kind of a legal way of talking about countries and states. So we're classifying things initially by what country's law is this book about. So most countries or lawmaking bodies are assigned one or two capital letters in the scheme. So, for example, the US is S, but then individual states as lawmaking bodies within that have their own codes. The European Union has a code. It's arranged alphabetically, but it's split between the origins of the legal systems as to which original legal system they were derived from. So each country has its own code, but where it sits in the alphabet is effectively, for some countries, defined by who it was colonized by and therefore forced to change its legal system to fit into that. This means that neighbouring countries are not always next to each other in the alphabet. And so due to space in the library, consecutive letters are not always next to each other on the shelves either. And I'm aware that very few classification schemes are initially ordered by geographical context, but I think it's sort of a point that does usually appear somewhere in schemes. And I think there's a lot to discuss, and I'm going to try and tackle a few areas that have caused me the most problems so far. I mentioned that the scheme was alphabetical and that could be limiting, and I think that's really exemplified on the next slide. So what we're looking at here is a photograph of the section of the classification scheme that covers Nordic and Eastern European countries, including Soviet and post-Soviet states. So it's covered in pencil annotations that I've made and that colleagues have made after cross-referencing it with the other hard copies of the scheme. Because as I said, there is no centralized updated record or database. So it's all done by hand and it doesn't always match each copy. The scheme was written in the 1970s, which is 20 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And as I said, it's never been properly updated. So all of these sort of new or changing countries since then have been done by hand and by guesswork. The most recent addition is Moldova, which is also the clearest one, because not long before we left the library, actually, we had a book through on Moldovan competition law, and we were in uproar trying to find a new combination of T's and V's, and then that sparked a whole longer checking process to see what countries we were missing and if we had any in the scheme that were no longer states. And if we had a few instances where we had duplicates, so we had the same code in 2 different books but for different countries, and what that might mean for what's on the shelf. And I think this leads me on to the next slide, which we have 3 flags here. So left to right, it's Palestine, the Republic of North Macedonia, and South Sudan. So I'm going to start with North Macedonia. It's the flag of the Republic of North Macedonia, which until last year was Macedonia. We have it in the scheme, in pencil probably, as Macedonia. It was just a name change. There were no change to sort of country boundaries, no separation. But obviously, in bigger schemes, these kind of name changes are sort of monitored and updated centrally. We've really struggled with how do you do that when it's, only one part of your job is doing the classification, let alone keeping a scheme up to date, and who has responsibility for noticing and making those changes. I think it's quite interesting to think about. On the right, we've got the flag of the youngest or most recent country in the world, South Sudan. As I've mentioned, adding in new countries can be difficult in terms of the scheme itself, but I think it also affects the collections, because when you have changes to countries in terms of separations or divisions, do you move things? How do you decide what might now, that was previously just in Sudan, now come under South Sudan? Do you make a distinction between pre and post separation in existing countries? So one I noticed was that Gambia and Senegal had a short-lived merge as the Senegambia Confederation in the 1980s. So if you're organizing things geographically or by jurisdiction, should you differentiate between pre and post confederation in those countries? Do you remove it from the scheme if a country dissolves, and move books around? And again, I don't have an answer, but I think it's interesting. And if anyone's got any feedback on that, I think that'd be really interesting. I also think it's a political decision in some cases to choose to recognize things in your classification scheme. So in the case of states or jurisdictions, I think Palestine is a great example. So Palestine has its own lawmaking bodies. However, it's not universally recognized as an independent sovereign state, which I think highlights how, lots of people have dealt with this better than me, but classification is subjective and it's a very personal and definitive choice to include or exclude certain things from being in the scheme. Because once you make that statement, it can have big implications beyond meaning just that letter on the book means it goes where it goes on the shelf. I think choosing to recognize and acknowledge things in the scheme can be a contentious issue, and I'm aware that there are institutions and individuals that aren't happy to take that risk or don't agree with those decisions. I'm going to move on now to talk about subdivision, which I know a lot of other schemes lead with, and I'm sure have the same problems. But again, I think for small schemes, it is more difficult because we're dealing with it ourselves and having to make on-the-spot decisions with little outside guidance. And as I've mentioned, it was specifically written for the collections of the library, which were developed in line with faculty teaching, which meant it was designed to cover a much tighter subject area than some of the other more popular schemes. So in a way, this works really well, as it means that all the various areas of subjects being taught are represented, but it makes it a lot harder to slot new areas in, or in some cases, because it is so specific, it's difficult to use what's there properly. So I've just got 3 quick excerpts from the scheme because I think they exemplify this. I'm going to kind of go through them quite quickly because I'm looking at the time. But at the top is a section about regulation. I've had to add internet in because since 1971, nobody thought we'd need to put internet in, which is fine. In 1971, there was no internet, but it's a new technology that couldn't have been foreseen. And I think that's important thinking going forward. How much foresight do you need to have if you're making changes to things like this? Is it okay to put things like cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in if you don't know where those technologies are going to go, or really what they mean for society? And I think that applies to classification, but also just to libraries in general, sort of physical organization of collections, maybe planning for new and expanded library spaces. A lot of this is often organized by what people want or need now. And I think it's very difficult to look forward, but I think the scheme illustrates that no, it doesn't always work to write things for now, but what does? And we've got, this was a quick one in the middle. It's very faint, I'm sorry. It says environmental law. Just that wasn't the terminology that was used for that area of work at the time. So we've had to change that to reflect sort of changing and emerging areas of work, particularly things like climate change law would not fit into public control of land use, but it does very much come under environmental law. And then at the bottom, it's terrorism, which is in the international law section of the scheme, which was never in the scheme originally, again, but obviously now that's a really popular area of study among people that use the library, so it's made sense to have somewhere specific that can be found. This is the area of the scheme that covers the individual and municipal law, which I don't really know what it means, but I think we normally interpret it more widely as sort of civil rights, inequality, those kind of things usually go into this section. Again, it's very faint, I'm sorry, but you can see it's been, all of it's been crossed out except for the top line, because to my knowledge, it's never been used past the top division. I don't know why, but it means that as it stands now, there are so many different things in that one section that cover a very wide range of topics, really. But then in terms of practicality, it'd be lovely to change it and separate it all up, but we don't have the time. And I think you have to weigh up what is practical with what you think should be done. And I'm just a quick content warning for the next slide. It mentions murder, abortion, and suicide in relation to the law, and I'm not going to talk about any of them in sort of any sort of depth, but if you'd rather avoid them, please feel free to duck out if you want to. I'm just going to move on now. So this is a subsection of the criminal law area of the scheme, which covers offences against the person. And I think it highlights how much the general understanding of the topics can change as to whether things are in the, the right or the wrong place. Imagine there were some air quotes there. Would I consider murder and suicide and abortion as comparable acts? No, but I know that, there will be people in the world that think that that is the right place for them to go. So I think, again, it's very subjective to where you think things could go, and how do you go about using a scheme that is organised in a way that you might fundamentally disagree with. I think also this section is interesting because it is based on the law, and as we know, just because something's legal or illegal is no real reflection on whether it's morally right or wrong. But so suicide and abortion, for example, I think until the 60s for both were covered by the Offences Against the Person Act, which could be why they're included in this section, rather than the author making a moral judgment on them. But there's not a way of knowing that. There's not always a way of knowing why something is in a certain place, which makes it very difficult to know when and how it's okay to change them. And I've also heard the point, which again, I don't know if I agree with, but I suppose underpins this whole thing, which is that does it matter what it says in the scheme if the book is on the shelf and people know where it is and can find it? So with that, I'm going to move on to my final section. This is a vague heading, external factors, but I'm essentially going to quickly talk about some non-scheme factors that are affecting how we interpret and use classification in the library, and I hope this is where kind of it's more widely applicable. So a big one is changing technologies, and this is an excerpt from the scheme, which says that we should only use certain letters in the scheme. It says further on that you shouldn't use B and P because the computer might confuse them. And here I think it says both time and space in a computer are valuable. you know, computers themselves between 1971 or 1972 and now are just a completely different thing. But I think this also maps onto how people use the library itself. I find people are often using it as a place for work or a place to do things. I know a lot of people in public libraries use it for the internet and the computers and the services rather than necessarily browsing the shelves. And also we have an online catalogue, so people usually search for material online, which I think changes the whole way people use and interpret library organisation. So this is just a picture of some recent additions and alterations we made to allow for the inclusion of general and legal study skills in the scheme, because books on those specific topics are becoming increasingly popular, and it made sense again to need their own section. We've also seen increases in material like training and practitioner texts, as students like to use them to prepare for, you know, after university, as well as the heavily used by alumni and faculty members for their work. And there's also been a steady increase in the amount of interdisciplinary work being carried out, which I think is only applicable to academic libraries, but it has required the collection and therefore the classification to be flexible to non-legal texts. And I mentioned briefly earlier that the Squire Law Library receives some of the legal texts from the legal deposit scheme, where certain libraries in the UK and Ireland receive copies of all published material for preservation purposes. And for us, this means that the collection has expanded beyond its key purpose to support the teaching and research in the faculty. And therefore, the classification scheme is affected because we're automatically receiving brand new material just because it's been published. And with a scheme that's designed to organise a collection that supports the teaching, a lot of that doesn't easily fit in. So what next? Well, firstly, an update. I have no idea when I will even be in a library to think about classifying a book, let alone having the time or the energy to overhaul an entire classification scheme. But I think that's obviously very unique to now. But ultimately, what I wanted to say is that the approach to finding books is different and changing. So as I mentioned, everyone uses online catalogues rather than browsing or using a printed catalogue, which means library users tend to seek out the books they need online and just need to know where those specific things are in the library, and that's if they even come into the library at all. So the only person really who's using and navigating the scheme is the person doing the classification. And considering that, you know, in our library, that's me. In other libraries, there'll be teams of people doing that. But the point is that it's not a universal thing. Most people using the library have no need or desire to sort of understand and interpret the scheme or why things are where they are, except for knowing what's on the book and where it is. So it can feel, I think, a bit self-indulgent to spend so much time thinking about the nooks and crannies of something that lots of people either don't think about or find boring. But I do think there's some merit in considering things. I recently read a quote, I think it's in one of the books. I've got a reading slide at the end and I've gone blank. But it was something like, what I like about knowing a biased retrieval tool is that I can figure out why I'm not getting what I should be getting. And I think that's something I've been taking with me while trying to figure out how to navigate working with a classification scheme that never is it's never quite right. That if we know, especially in smaller libraries, if we know the quirks and the inconsistencies and we can still find what we need or help others find what we need, things usually end up okay. And that might be enough, even if it's not very conclusive. So I think if we've got time, if anyone's got any questions or feedback or anything, that would be great.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really, really interesting, and I say that as someone that doesn't consider themselves particularly interested in library organisation. I will, at this moment, just take a second to tell you about my session this afternoon, the Decolonisation Read, Reflect and Discussion Group. The paper that we read is really covers these issues as well. So if you have time to attend that, that's the last session of today, please do. And I have a few questions for you. I'll do the ones that have come through on private message to me, and then it looks like some others are coming through on the chat as well. So first question for you, Sarah, is given the role of serendipitous browsing, do you agree that it doesn't matter where things come from in the scheme as long as users can find them?
I mean, I'm inclined to say that I don't agree, because otherwise, where would a lot of my job go, you know? But I think it's interesting, and I think it really depends sort of what people are interested in as to whether that is something that they care about or not. Whether some people do just want to walk into a library and find the book they want and get out because they've got other things to do and they're not interested. But other people do want to browse and find things. And I think it is important that those sort of things I've talked about are considered, because otherwise it feels, I think, irresponsible sometimes to continue working with things that you know are not right and that might upset people or offend people. So I think if you want to talk about sort of like responsibility, and do you have responsibility as a member of library staff, I mean that's a whole other thing. But I think maybe.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, does your classification scheme affect where in the library books on other countries' laws are located? And by what they mean by that is, are they less discoverable?
So, I mean, so we're over 3 floors. And as I think I said earlier, it's kind of organised in the scheme as to what legal system it came from, and that's been replicated in the library, I think, mostly. So on the first floor is most of the UK law, and I think the reason behind that was that is usually what's taught, because law as a degree is a qualifying degree, so you do need to qualify in the UK as a lawyer, you need to have studied certain areas of English and UK law. But other than that, it is mostly done by the alphabet. I think everything, we've tried to make sure things are very clearly labelled. I think we try. And I think because there's workspaces on every 3 floors, like all the 3 floors are identical, so people do actually tend to cover them, and anything off of reading lists, and sometimes a lot of the things on reading lists are all over the library, so people do sort of use it all. Nothing's tucked away.
Great, thank you. Next question. In sections like offences against the person, how do you approach the idea that libraries and their classification systems should be objective, in quotes, with the fact that any person writing or updating them will always have subjective views? And the question person has said, I suppose with a bigger classification scheme, you might have a committee making decisions, which provides an amount of balance.
Yeah, so I think that's the point, is that a lot of the bigger ones have committees and things are sort of crowdsourced, and there's opportunities for feedback on changes. Whereas if it's me in an office going, oh, what do you think? That doesn't have quite the same accountability to it. But I think, I mean, I'm inclined to always say that you can never achieve objectivity. I think trying to in itself is sometimes a failed task, because there are things that everything changes, and I think there's very few issues that people come to with no ideas about. So I think, you know, depending on your life and your experiences, there's probably no issues that you can take an objective stance to. So I don't know if it's possible to replicate that in a way that doesn't involve some sort of accountability and community feedback process like some of the bigger schemes have. I hope that answered it.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Lots of people saying they kind of agree with you there. Found your talk really, really interesting. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I've just had a comment that someone would just like to mention the importance of users browsing books from the shelves. In this respect, classification becomes very important. It helps with serendipitous finds, and many thanks. Which I think, sorry, just to vaguely answer that comment myself. I think it's really interesting because I work in a library that prioritizes ebooks. So our collections policy says that we buy ebooks as first where possible, and it's really interesting to me to think about like where does serendipity come in when you don't have a physical book or physical shelves to kind of look at, and I also think classification is really important in that sense as well, and the kind of subject terms, etc. I always think with our search system is pretty bad at surfacing ebooks and relevant ebooks. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I think again I think it depends on what the person wants. If people want to browse, I think that can be difficult. Often if people want something on a subject but don't have a sense of, for us, what area of the world they're looking at, it's very difficult because there are hundreds of places that there might be a book on that subject because it's not initially organized by subject. Whereas a lot of libraries, you can walk in and find the section on, I don't know, you can find the section on feminism. You know, it's not already divided at a very distinct level. But, you know, lots of people do browse, and I think browsing is important if that's something that you're interested in. But again, like Michelle said, a lot of things are online, and then how do you browse if you can't browse? It's very difficult sometimes.
Okay, so that is the end of the session. Thank you so much to Sarah. That's really a really great presentation from you. Thank you so much. Lots of really thought-provoking things in it. Lots of people in the chat just saying thank you so much and how interesting it was. So please give yourself a round of applause, since you know we can't all hear it for you, but I will give you a round of applause. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone for attending as well. So we're going to take a break now. There are some posts in the forum if you wanted to go and check out the forum. And also if you wanted to go hang out in the water cooler room or just take a break. And the next sessions start at 12:15. So thanks again, Sarah.
Great, thanks everyone for coming.